We should get going. We'll get going now. It's already 7:02. Okay, good evening, everyone, and welcome to our October professional development meeting, ASCM professional development meeting. And as you all know today, that for everywhere, when you turn on TV, everywhere you will hear the supply chain problems, disruption. And this is another topic which is more appropriate. And the topic is how electric vehicles are going to disrupt supply chain and transform industries. And such an interesting topic. So we have an expert on it. His name is Saravanan Palanivelu. He's a business leader who has driven strategy, led business and digital transformation for Fortune 500 companies across the globe. And he has worked in various industries such as automotive, heavy equipment, and CPG. With over 20 years of diverse experience in supply chain, Saravanan partners with organizations to improve their performance and create value. Currently, Saravanan is a senior director at Tata Cognitive Solutions. He helps companies with the digital transformation, acting as an advisor to supply chain and procurement executives. Welcome, Saravanan, and we all look forward to this, such an exciting topic. And again, welcoming all the participants, and let's start.
Very good. Well, thank you for the great introduction, Sridhar, and thank you for the opportunity. Good evening, everyone. So, as the topic suggests, when you look at the automotive industry these days, cars, it plays a major role in our life. For over 100 years, we have been using gasoline as our fuel to drive our cars. And that is going to change. Cars are going electric. Not just cars, most what they call as light duty vehicles and heavy duty vehicles like buses and trucks are also becoming electric. So what does this mean for us? You may already see these vehicles on the road. You see Teslas, you see Chevys, you see Nissan Leaf. And then recently Ford announced F-150 and Mach-E. So these cars are slowly starting to emerge on the streets, and you will see more and more of these cars in the future. So this electrification process, what we call, is going to impact all of us, whether we own a vehicle or a car or not. Even if you don't own a car, this electrification process is going to affect you. So we will discuss what those impacts are in our day-to-day life in various industries. We will focus in this conversation, we will focus our discussion around supply chain and manufacturing and what the impact it has. We will leave the environmental discussion out of scope, and we will leave it to the experts to discuss those topics. And as we go into this is a topic most of you are probably interested in. So let's make this more interactive. Feel free to ask questions as we go through this, because each one of this topic we are covering can go as deep as you want. So we can talk about this topic all day. So we have about 40 minutes. So we will go over at a high level, but please stop me and ask your questions at any time. So just to start, so do any of you already own an electric vehicle or plan to buy one?
At least I'm planning to buy one.
Okay, very good, very good.
Yeah.
Anybody else thinking about it or not sure about how the future holds? Okay, I see another hand. Okay. I think I think the sample size here represents a little bit about what the population of vehicles we have on the market. And so before we go into some of these discussions, let's talk a little bit about electric vehicle history. So how old are electric vehicles, do you think? Are they 10 years old, 20 years old, 30 years old?
I consider like
Anybody
around
guess?
10 years probably. I don't know, maybe it's
Right?
earlier. 10 years is what I know.
Yeah, that's a recent history, definitely. So if you actually look at it, electric vehicles are actually more than 100 years old. As a matter of fact, the original electric vehicle was invented in the early 1800s. They were experimenting with motors and whatnot. However, in the late 1800s, what they called at that point is a horseless carriage, because obviously it's a shift happening at that point, came about in the 1890s. So in 1890, the first usable electric vehicle was developed. So even when all these cars are coming up, whether it's steam engines, gasoline engines, petrol, diesel, electric cars were also at the same time originated. And by 1900, 38% of all US vehicles were electric. So this was actually marketed uh, predominantly with all the consumers because people see a lot of convenience in electric. So we had gasoline cars as well simultaneously, but people preferred electric cars for various reasons. At that point, gasoline cars were very noisy. They didn't have mufflers or better exhaust systems, so they were very noisy. And so electric cars was noiseless. It was comfortable. Electric cars did not have gears. So even now they don't. I mean, now everything is gearless, but electric cars don't need gears, transmissions, and it worked well in winter. And the main reason for electric car everybody liked at that point was you don't have to crank it to start. In 1900 there was no starter motor. So if you think about how you start your lawnmowers these days, gasoline lawnmowers, that's how you have to pretty much start your cars. So not everybody was interested in gasoline cars. And even in 1900s, they were marketing these cars for business people and women because it's easier to start and drive around. They even that you would probably see if you look for it commercials like gift your wife an electric car this Christmas. So there are commercials like that. So however, as the year progressed, by 1912, 1916, electric starters were invented, mufflers were invented, and mass production technique was brought in, and it became very common. So at that point, you would probably hear about how Ford invented the mass production lines and whatnot. ICE vehicles, ICE means internal combustion engine vehicles, which is our traditional cars, came into the market. And with starters, exhaust, and the mass production, the price started to go down dramatically. So by 1916, gasoline vehicle price was $350, which is much lower than electric cars. So it started to get popular. And by 1930, electric vehicles started to decline, and the main reason being the range. So the battery technology was not there. So the battery range was low, and the vehicles started to decline and pretty much starting to disappear at that point. So the gasoline vehicles picked up. But however, over the years, there were some peaks of interest that came across. So in 1970, they once again tried to renew their interest in electric cars because there was an oil crisis, but it didn't last long. Then in 1990, all the way to the recent decades, California came up with the Clean Air Initiative, emission initiative. So electric cars started to appear, but then that initiative was dropped, and those cars actually got destroyed. I think the companies actually bought those cars back from the consumers because, by law, those cars, you need to support the aftermarket for 10 years, and they were not ready to do that. So they basically bought those cars back and destroyed those cars. So then finally in 1997, we started to see Prius, which is the first hybrid vehicle, which is not purely electric, but the technology is starting to change. And then in 2006, Tesla announced their first long range vehicles. And by doing that, they kickstarted this new revolution into electric vehicles. And then from 2010, we have Chevy Bolts and Nissan Leaf, and rest is history. So as you can see, electric car is not actually very new. They're very old. The gasoline car took over for various reasons, and the electric car, we didn't invest enough research in it to improve the range, and it died down. But latest and technological, especially the battery technology, has helped us to move towards the direction. So let's quickly look at, okay, so what does it mean, right? So where are we right now with this whole electric vehicles? What is the current state, and where are we going with this? Because it is important to understand so that we can prepare for it. So can anyone guess how many cars there are in the whole world, passenger cars? You can see my screen for a hint, but I don't know. I don't think it tells you much, and how much is electric?
Maybe the blue one is the only one electric.
That's right. So
Yeah.
So if you really look at it, there are about 1.4 billion cars. This is the whole inventory of cars right now in the whole world, and EVs represent about only 1% of them. Okay, so about 10 to 15 million, around that range. So it's not a lot at this point. However, the trend is growing. So if you look at the EV stock numbers, as you can see, in the last 5 years, it's going exponentially high. So going from by end of 2020, we had about 10 million vehicles on the road to projected 16 million by end of the year. And if you look at the individual sales of electric vehicles, from 2019 to 2020, there were about 40% increase. But the projected increase from 2020 to this year, by end of this year, is about 6 million, which is 100% increase. So as you can see, the adoption was slower for various reasons, but a lot of policies and consumer perception, technology, all of these are driving this growth in an exponential manner. So it's not a linear growth, it's an exponential growth. So that's something we should keep in mind. And can anyone guess where this growth is happening? So if you take globally, different regions, so US, Asia, Europe, can anyone guess where these growths are happening? Between these three regions?
My guess is probably Asia.
Yes. So China and Europe are leading. Actually, they are competing against each other in certain ways. So if you look at the overall sales, pretty much Europe and China has the major market for EV. And if you see the trend, China has adopted EV much earlier than US and even Europe. And recently the growth is slowed because of pandemic. However, Europe, they had huge increase in adoption because there were a lot of government initiatives and regulations put in place to drive this growth. So the Europe growth is tremendous. China is leading. So majority of the market is in Europe and China, and US unfortunately is lagging behind, and even there our growth dropped last year on the EV market. And yeah, go
I'm
ahead.
sorry to interrupt. Can I ask a quick question?
Of course.
When you talk about EVs, does that include hybrid too, or is it strictly 100% electric?
Plug-in, it's a great question. So EVs is electric, pure electric, and plug-in hybrid. It has to be plugged in. Anything plugged in is EV. Yeah.
Okay, thank you very much.
And that's a good clarification. Not the non-plug-in EVs. Yeah. So as you can see, China and Europe are leading this. And when you look at the heavy duty market or the micro mobility, what we call the micro mobility, they are also growing. So in the heavy duty, we're talking about buses and trucks, and it's not as fast as the cars, but there is still momentum there. And the micro mobility is an area that is growing, also getting popular. So you may see this scooter, this appeared like few years back, and all of a sudden it's everywhere. It's on the side of the road, it's on the walkways. It's almost became a nuisance on how many scooters you could see, e-scooters you could see in cities. So that's growing as well. And the two-wheelers, especially in Asian market and European market, there's a lot of two-wheelers. There's about 1 in 3 vehicles of two-wheelers is electric these days. So definitely the market is growing there as well. And then, so the market is growing, but if you look at who is manufacturing these vehicles, what are the new players coming into this? There are a ton of them. So if you look at EV industry, there are like 200 plus companies worldwide. So if I ask you to, for example, if I ask you to go and name a traditional automaker, you would probably name GM, Ford, Toyota, Volkswagen, Nissan, that type of companies. But if you look at who are the players in the EV, majority of them are startups. Almost half of them are startup companies across the whole ecosystem. So a lot of players are getting into this. And this EV market, it's no more an automotive industry, it's like a technology industry. It's a technology race. So we need to look at it like we would look at a technology company and how they are growing, how a startup tech companies are growing. So, China alone has 100 plus auto manufacturers. There is so much out there that government is encouraging people to consolidate. Otherwise there is too many EV companies out there to manage. And if you look at the top EV companies by sales, you would see that there's only 2 or 3 of them that are traditional, but rest of them are all new companies. So this is the trend that we are seeing now. The major automakers were in one ways dragged into this game recently, kicking and screaming by the growth in China, the growth in Europe, and by companies like Tesla, Rivian, and Lucid, all of these companies. So now you see every major companies like Volkswagen, Ford, GM, they are starting to get into this in this market, investing heavily on this. So what does all this mean to the growth? We are looking at anywhere between 30 to 50% of sales of electric vehicles by 2030, which is by end of this decade. And this is driven by various policies we discussed. And one thing to keep in mind, these projections are not final. These projections are changing every quarter. The growth may even happen much sooner than they are predicting, because the automakers out there have, almost 18 out of 20 major automakers have put out goals of electrification by 2030. Some of them are 30%, some of them are at 50%, some of them are 100% electrification. So this whole change is happening, and it's just a It's not a matter of if or when, it's a matter of how much is it going to happen? How fast is it going to happen? So that's what we should be looking to. So before we go and understand, okay, what this number means to us, how does this growth going to affect us in supply chain, in manufacturing, in other industries? We need to understand a little bit about the difference between what is an electric vehicle and what is a ICE or internal combustion vehicle or the traditional cars. Can anybody talk about that? I'm sure everybody here knows a little bit about cars. So what's the major difference between electric vehicles and internal combustion or ICE vehicles?
Range of travel, the distance you can go.
Okay, good point. That's a different, definitely a unique perspective there. I didn't expect that as the first answer.
Hey, I don't care how the engine works. I just want it to get me there. But that for me is a drawback with the limited travel range of an electric vehicle.
Okay, fair point.
I think the other thing is there are more components in ICE, whereas I think as even the graph, the picture shows, there's only very few in the
Right.
EVs, in the EV.
Correct. Okay, yeah, I mean, both of you are correct. So EV has fewer systems and parts than ICE vehicles. That's one of the major difference when it comes from the purely manufacturing and supply chain point of view. So the traditional cars have gasoline as fuel, and then that is pumped into an engine, which converts that into which makes the engine run, and then which drives the transmission, and then which drives the vehicle overall. However, on the electric side, you have battery as a source of energy, which drives a motor, which drives the car. There is no transmission in there. So if you look at a powertrain is primarily focused on what moves the car. The gasoline vehicle has thousands of components compared to EV, which has about hundreds of components. So there are components like starters, electric starters, alternators, turbochargers, transmissions, fuels and exhaust systems, radiators, like cooling systems. All of those are missing when you move into electric vehicles. However, the biggest add to electric vehicle is the battery and the power electronics with the high voltage wiring. So this is a difference we need to understand, because this is directly relates to the impact it's going to create. So when we look at the comparison here, EVs are also 30% more expensive than traditional ICE vehicles. So the chart over here explains. So for example, if you assume a car costs $100, a traditional ICE vehicle, and we take the transmission out, we take the engine out, and we take a few other components out, we are left with about $70 of structure. And to convert that to EV, we add battery, which is about $51, which is the most expensive part. And then power electronics on top of that and few other components, we end up with $130. So it's about 30% more. In real world terms, it's about 12,000 to 15,000 more than that's a difference between an ICE vehicle and EV vehicle, electric vehicle. And obviously, battery is the heaviest and the most expensive component for EV. A battery is almost 1/3 of the vehicle cost. Vehicle weight compared to ICE. So battery is really heavy. It goes under the whole body of the car, and so the reduction of weight and reduction of cost of battery cells is the most important goal for electric vehicle manufacturers, while improving the range, as was pointed out. So these batteries are made of what we call the lithium ion cells. These are actually, they're not they're like AA sized individual cells. Thousands of them goes into a battery pack and gets recharged and modularized and put in the vehicle. So one of the things that is driving adoption or is a hindrance to adoption is the price as well as the range. So what experts are predicting is maybe these are terms we need to get used to, the kilowatt hour. So batteries are measured in kilowatt hours. So for example, a Tesla has a 85 kilowatt hour battery. Okay, so something just to relate to that. So if you look at the cost of a kilowatt hour, we were at $1,200 per kilowatt hour in 2010. But as you can see, the steep decrease in the price. And last year we were at 137. And what experts are predicting is when the battery price goes down to 100 per kilowatt hour, the price parity will be established between ICE and EV vehicle. And this is not too far into the future. So this is happening. A lot of R&D is happening around battery technology, how we can make the batteries denser and cheaper and to have more range, so that there will be more adoption. The next important thing for adoption is the infrastructure. So battery combined with charging infrastructure is very important for people to switch to EVs. However, this is where there is a perception versus some sort of a reality. Is 80% of the charging happens overnight at home. So if you look at how people drive cars, people on an average drive about 13,000 miles a year, and however, most of the driving on a day-to-day basis, an average of 40 to 50 miles a day. So for that particular driving, for a 40 to 50 mile range, EVs can support with this 80% people charging overnight. So it's almost like you're using your cell phone, you plug it at night, and then you wake up, you use your cell phone. The cars are becoming like that. However, the remaining 20% of the time you want to go on the highway. So to make this is what we call the range anxiety. So to make that range anxiety go away, we need better infrastructure. So when you want to charge somewhere, you don't have to drive 100 miles to find the next charger, but rather find the charger quicker and charge. So the charging installation is also going up, so to accommodate for this growth in EV. And there are certain, this is a growing industry. There are charging standards are not established yet. Every car maker, Ford has their own version of charging. Nissan has their own version. Tesla has their own version. So all of these standards have to be established. So this accommodation becomes much more easier. And of course, the charging speed, although this is drastically going down, the charging speed right now takes about 20 to 30 minutes, and that needs to be improved as well. Any questions so far? Okay. So now that we understood how EVs are going to go up, what is the growth projection, and what is the difference between EVs and ICE vehicles, let's take a look at how it is going to affect manufacturing, supply chain, and other industries. So we will look at this from the manufacturer's point of view. If you are an OEM, what do you need to do and how it is going to affect you? And then we'll look at it from the supplier point of view. If you're a supplier, how it is going to affect you. And then we will look at it also from other industry point of view, like battery, infrastructure, and certain other industries. So if you are a manufacturer, to succeed in this overall EV race, they need to design their supply chain for rapid growth and agility. And agility is the key here, because one is rapid growth. So demand is gonna go up very fast, which we can do, but we need to be agile because change is going to happen. This market is changing very quickly. Technology is changing very quickly. We need to be very agile to adapt to this. So if you are a manufacturer, this is a time you either make the shift or risk losing business. So as you can see, for a while it was Tesla, and then we had Rivian and few other Lucid and few other car makers. Then Volkswagen came in, but by the way, the change was happening in China. There were hundreds of automakers there, about a handful of them predominantly supplying to China. But the major traditional automakers, they didn't get into the game. But then they saw the potential. Now they are all making huge shifts. Volkswagen is making a huge shift. Ford is announcing, they just recently announced $11 billion investment. They committed another 11 billion towards electrification. So if you don't make the shift, you'll risk losing the business. There is one predominant car company which is actually working backwards in certain ways. Can you guess who it is? Of the main car companies, there's one car company which is somewhat blocking this and moving in the opposite direction.
Hope it's not Chrysler.
No, it's actually Toyota.
Toyota.
So yes, so if you look at it, Toyota is, I guess, they bet heavily on hybrids. So they design their whole future around sorry, I shouldn't say hybrid, around fuel cells or hydrogen fuel cell vehicles, that they are very heavily pushing back on battery electric vehicles. And they are even, I read articles about how they're even lobbying to slow down the progress of this electrification so that the technology on the fuel cells can catch up. So that's been a very talked topic in the automotive industry on how Toyota is kind of very late to the game and somewhat very hesitant in getting into this. So you either make the shift or you are at risk. And then once you make the shift, you need to create the strategy. So there's lots going on. So you need to decide what to produce, where to produce, and how to produce. So there may be, if you're a traditional automaker, you have decisions to make about, do you want to open a whole new pure EV plant, or do you want to change your assembly lines into a mixed mode line so you can do both? There are pros and cons in either side. And also, who is going to produce? Am I going to produce in-house? Am I outsource it? We have to make those make or buy decisions. All of these needs to be thought out very clearly on what strategy you want to take. And even though there are less number of parts in EV, the assembly process is still as involved, or in some cases complicated, than the traditional automaker, because we've been doing this over 100 years. So the assembly process has been optimized for the traditional manufacturing line, but the EV lines are still at their early stages. So there are still a lot of learnings needs to happen there. So those new manufacturing techniques need to be thought through. Even if you're a traditional manufacturer, you have to think about how do you manufacture an EV. And of course, supply chain redesign. Now your supply base is probably 50-50, 50 old and 50 new. You will be working with suppliers who have never supplied to automakers. So you need to redesign your supply chain, especially the battery supply chain. So whoever dominates this battery supply chain is going to win this game, because battery supply chain is the most important aspect of this. So many companies, I mean, this, we see Tesla's business model here, are very vertically integrated. So you control what the critical components you needed for your production, especially in this case, the battery as well as the charging network. So even Ford is partnering with, I think, SK batteries. They're from a Chinese company, and installing two battery. Those are the two companies they announced recently about the battery capacity. So that is very critical. And there's also some concerns about there is less parts, so we may not need as many labors. That's not entirely true, because the assembly requires a little bit of a complicated process, and also it's at the early stages. You would require those labor force, but they would require additional training to accommodate that. And most important of all, you need visibility into your supply chain, especially right now when everything is critical. So supply chain visibility is key. So start digitizing the supply chains. Look, there are all kinds of solutions out there. You need to digitize your supply chain. You need to connect not just your tier ones, tier twos, and tier threes, so you know what's in the pipeline and you can adapt and be agile to what is available as materials. So these are things a manufacturer should be thinking about. But when you look at suppliers, that's another different story here. Suppliers are the most affected in this. Here, suppliers have, there are three types of suppliers, if you will. Suppliers who are supplying the traditional disappearing parts like engines, transmissions, exhaust, and cooling. And there are suppliers who may not see very much change. I mean, the suppliers like, if you are supplying seats and certain HVAC units and things like that, you are probably going through some change, but your business is probably not affected as much. And then there are new suppliers coming into that who are supplying batteries, the motors, the power electronics needed for that, the battery management systems, all of these suppliers coming into play. So suppliers need to really look at their portfolio and make a decision on how they want to move forward. You either stay with your business, and if you don't, and see how it turns out. The adoption is slow, so you won't see the change immediately, but it is surely coming. So you need to start acting towards that. Or you can innovate and bring new components into your product portfolio, or diversify. You can probably supply to aerospace or other industries and diversify your business if you're on the disappearing parts list. But again, think like a tech company here. Don't think like a traditional automaker. Be agile, because you're going to be competing with suppliers who are used to supplying to tech companies, and who are startups. They're very agile. You need to think like that. But the traditional parts companies have an advantage, because usually OEMs like working with existing suppliers than new suppliers, because of all the regulations and training and supplier development activities they need to go through. So improving your product portfolio, you could get the business that could potentially may go to a new supplier getting into that business. But if you're a new supplier coming into the auto industry, then you're out there for a rude awakening, because the volumes and the pace at which automakers work, these new suppliers are not used to. Traditionally, some of the electronic suppliers traditionally used to supplying to some of the tech companies. When they move into auto industry, it's a whole different ball game they need to get prepared for. And obviously collaboration is key, and again, connected systems, synchronizing the demand and supply signals between OEMs and your suppliers and different tiers. this is very key in terms of how you can adapt to this changing environment. And even people are challenging the just-in-time concept. Just-in-time concept is really working anymore. Now it cannot be just in time, it has to be a risk-based supply chain. So you have to have enough technological advancement, visibility into your supply chain, so you can react to these adverse things that is happening rather than just following a just-in-time logic. So all of these methods are being challenged. Questions? So going into the battery, sorry, there was a question.
I was just saying no.
Oh, okay, thanks. So we talked about battery, and this is the most important component and most important supply chain of all of the supply chains in EV. And if you look at how the battery supply chain currently is, 90% of batteries are coming from 6 companies, and all of them are in China, concentrated in Asia, not in China, concentrated in Asian region. So this is a huge bottleneck, and every OEMs are trying to partner with these guys, with LGs and Samsung and SK Innovation, the BYDs, to build their battery supply chain. So that's why Teslas and Fords and Volkswagens of the world are trying to build their own gigafactories, battery factories, to take better control of this. So this will be a huge bottleneck, and this is also a huge opportunity. Whoever controls this space. And the battery minerals, obviously the demand is huge, as you can see at the bottom here. Right now, without going into too much detail about how we look at gigawatt hours, you can just see the proportional change about between 2020 and 2030, how much more capacity is needed in the production of batteries, especially in the Asia Pacific and Europe region. So if you're a supplier, if you want to get into a battery supply chain game, this is the best option. And other industry that is growing is the battery recycling. This is one other way to compensate for mining and lack of minerals, raw materials. Recycling is going to be a multi-billion-dollar industry. There are few startups out there starting to do this, but it's predicted to be multi-billion-dollar industry. So currently, a battery can be recaptured around 60%, but this is also improving. There are some experimental cases where they can recapture 80% of usable materials from a used battery. So this is an industry to get involved in as well. Charging. So this is another thing, as it was pointed out earlier. The charging is, since most of the charging happens at home, we don't need more chargers in one sense. We need more denser chargers, as in denser network of chargers. So when you're driving around, you have a charger immediately available to charge, because most of the charging happens at home. And then, obviously we have the electric grid question. Can electric grid support this EV growth? And the simple answer, if you look at it purely from the numbers point of view, if 80% of the vehicles became electric tomorrow, that would require about 15% more electricity production. Okay. This is on an average globally. However, the situation with most electric grids they are controlled very locally. So some grids are good, some grids are bad. And it's also, the production is also varies from region to region, countries to country. So even though in theory, the increase is not that much, and getting to 80% electric cars is 30-40 years away. So the growth is gradual. So we don't need as much grid capacity. Maybe in the next 10 years, you would probably need about 2-3%, or at the most if 5%, if the number of cars goes up. However, the local grids needs to be upgraded, and there are technology out there that can address this, but this is an area that needs to be focused on. And gas stations out there are also struggling to see, hey, what is the ROI in the EV charging game for me? So they are also looking into this, and there is a tendency that gas stations, they're not going to go away, but the locations may need switch around a little bit, and as you know, for a gas station, their profit is on what you buy inside the convenience store than the gas itself, because 70% of their profit comes from inside, not from outside. So, but gas is a way of getting customers in. So they are also evaluating what is their ROI going to be. So, we are getting closer. But if you look at the impact that it is going to have, the switching to EV, this is going to have a profound impact, not just companies directly related to automakers, but it's going to impact various other industries. So this is going to be a dramatic slide, but that's the reality. So mining is going to be affected. The other thing the startup automakers are going towards is direct sales to consumers. So they're not using dealers as a means to sell their cars. So that industry is going to get affected as well. Same goes for repair shops. You don't need regular oil changes anymore for EVs, and there are less components to repair or less moving parts, so less wear and tear. So repair shops is impacted. Another thing is aftermarket. So this is a concern as well. So if you have less wear and tear and less moving parts, you're not going to sell a lot of aftermarket parts. And aftermarket is a huge business for automotive industry. However, some experts are predicting the aftermarket price for gasoline vehicle is going to go up to compensate for the loss of business. So the price may increase for spare parts once EV volume increases as well. Battery recycle, we start about. Gas stations have to make a decision on how they compensate for this change in consumer behavior. Electric utility needs to be upgraded. Even though in theory we can support this growth, local grids need to evaluate their capacity and start upgrading. Power electronics, a lot of electronics, because they need high voltage wiring. Power electronics is important. And this is an interesting factoid. Since electric vehicles are heavier, they expect tires to be manufactured in a different way, or it's going to wear faster. So computer and gadgets. So the cars of the future, or the EVs of the future, are more like technology on wheels. And we already know how semiconductor shortages are affecting the existing car market. So this industry, as we more and more go towards EV, we're going to be competing with gadgets and computer industry, labor force, oil industry. Here I'm seeing different predictions. We may think, all electric cars, so there's going to be a huge hit on oil. However, there are predictions saying it's not as much impact to oil industry as we would think. Then the other part, I think GM also recently had a conversation about this, is